Hello, my friends. I wanted to make a video to reach out to you. We are in what we could call the Badlands of February. My father-in-law passed away 3 weeks ago, and we are heading out to his funeral this afternoon. And then my dad's first cousin passed away last weekend. I remember in campus ministry just seeing the prayer requests for students who had lost people. It always seemed to really hit a climax in January, February. These were not deaths due to COVID. But I know psychologically, getting through this part of the school year with weather in different parts of Michigan and the country, there's a bit of a slog. And I realized in a conversation with someone in the last month that as I process things verbally, that I don't want to lead anything ever again where I have to worry about who shows up in terms of like numbers, and I don't want to lead anything where I can't be vulnerable. I can't lead in and with my weakness. So I just wanted to touch base with you through this video, use the gift of the technology to somehow create a deeper rapport and intimacy with you. So I wanted to share a thought for us as we are wrestling with the tension between contemplation and prayer, and then justice, specifically in the context of racial equality. So I wanted to share a thought about that, express some of my own weakness, and then I wanted to do a little follow-up on, I sent out an email this week about the soft announcement on the School of Contemplative Listening that I will be co-facilitating with Cami Mann. So I wanted to follow up on that because I've had some people reach out with lots of questions. So first of all, out of my weakness, I want to say that I appreciate your patience with me as I learn how to facilitate the School of Prayer, as I announced from the very beginning. In my initial inquiry of trying to gather people, I did not facilitating this out of some level of expertise. I have my own struggle with my rule of life. We've hit many inroads back to depression through the last 3 months. Depression is something that runs in my family. I gladly inherited it from my mother. I say gladly because she also gave me many other beautiful gifts. And so just with the circumstances of kids, in and out of school, and then the holidays, and then snow days, and then midwinter break, it's been crazy town around our house at times. And so in the midst of that, what is it that I have to bring to the School of Prayer and beginning it and then facilitating it? What I have to bring is just a consistent reminder that all of what we're doing here is not about me or any one particular person. It all comes down to the disciplines and the practices that we're attempting, the group spiritual direction on our Zoom meetings, and then as we are able to attempt our respective rules, and then to come back and to learn from our failures as we attempt to grow into our rules. So I've made some bumbling mistakes with admin and different things like that. So I appreciate your feedback, appreciate your questions. I want to be someone you can trust with the details. We're learning a lot about how to facilitate everything by Zoom. So for better or worse, we have these internet-based resources, tools to connect with each other, and that is a steep learning curve. So with that said, leading out of my weakness, I'm just reminded as I made a post on Facebook in the last week in response to the impeachment trials, attempting to stir up conversation about what it would be like to be a Black person and to see the siege on the Capitol and to live through their eyes, and getting a lot of great comments on that, and then carrying that conversation in with other friends off of Facebook, and then taking that back into my prayer. I am reminded of this connection between social justice and then the question of how do I pray and how do I enter peace and trust. And so there really is this infighting in the church on this question of social justice. What is God's justice? And then I hear the pushback on what is a man-made construct. We could talk about identity politics. And there's a lot of pain of this reckoning, this truth-telling of how do we approach the question of racial identity? Can we use vocabulary like white supremacy and racism? Am I pointing fingers? Am I attempting to shame people? Am I attempting to call people to justice? Now, is that my justice or is that God's justice? So my vocabulary for this originally grew out of a relationship between Isaiah 32 and Psalm 51. And here's the passage from Isaiah 32, verse 16. The Lord's justice will dwell in the desert. His righteousness will live in the fertile land. The fruit of that righteousness, which if you look at the Hebrew is the fruit of that justice, will be peace. Its effect will be quietness and confidence forever. So there's that essential relationship that justice in this context leads to peace, where there are just acts, truth, righteousness, and holiness. That is by its essence in God's heart wed to quietness. It's we could say contemplation. When I define contemplation as that long, loving gaze on Jesus, on the presence of God. Justice births contemplation. But I also want to argue the flip, that the reverse is true, that contemplation leads to justice, that silence by its essence will bring us into holiness. And that's where I go with Psalm 51, where it says, you desire truth in the innermost being, therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. So Psalm 51 being the context of the greatest framing, the greatest vocabulary we have in the Psalms and in the whole of the Scriptures for what confession and repentance is. What is repentance? What is Psalm 51 attempting? To make those things which were wrong in me right before God, to lead me into holiness, that I would be washed, cleansed, pure as white as snow. And that requires me then to be able to practice a kind of honesty, to really see myself as thoroughly and as clearly as I can. So this is where we go back to that understanding of that self-knowledge and God knowledge are essentially connected. I'm not saying I'm God. I'm not saying that I want to just do a bunch of navel gazing, but I need to be able to see myself and to know myself. And most of that self-knowledge is not to build me up and to make me an effective team player for my job, which is great that people want to use the Enneagram for professional purposes. But the point of this self-knowledge that can be given to us through study and practice of the Enneagram, self-knowledge especially through something like centering, silence, inner calmness, is to see what comes up on the radar of my mind screen, and to see my brokenness, to see my fallibility, to see my weaknesses, and then to gladly confess, as I see my failures, to confess that and to live less through my self-dependence and more through a God dependence. So that inner knowledge, truth in the innermost being, forms in me a capacity to confess, which then makes me a just, holy person who is capable of then going into society, going to my neighbors, going into majorly painful questions about racial justice, equality, equity. I can't approach those bigger systemic questions until I've gotten my house in order. It's not necessarily an either or, it's going to be a both and. So, just to recap that, justice breeds, it nurtures silence. And silence nurtures and leads to justice. So I hope we can become anchored in that trust, in that God space, and that out of that we do not become people who add more pain to the questions around how to have conversations with our churches, our neighbors, with our families, with our spouses about what when I say white supremacy, I'm saying my capacity to trust my privilege and to be comfortable in the status quo. That's going to always by nature be a very painful conversation. But what I'm hoping is that my selfishness, my fear, my greed, my need to be right, that doesn't add more pain than it needs to. So one way for us to think about these questions of how we approach the enormity of, like, if you want to read critical race theory and Abraham and Robin DiAngelo, if you want to go to those depths, when I do, I'm seeing that through the theological lenses of Willie Jennings. So I can read that as a broken person with my history of fears and failures, and then I project myself into that. And if I'm not careful, then I will exacerbate the trouble with my brokenness. So I come to that. Let's just use the Enneagram for one way to talk about that. I come to this question of racial justice as a four, wanting to be special. Hey, look at me. I'm in on this. I'm woke, or I'm trying to be woke. And there's already massive trouble with that. And then we could go around the wheel on the Enneagram and see how each Enneatype brings certain gifts and certain weaknesses to that question. As a 3, how am I going to go and build and power through this and try to fix things before they really need to be solved? How am I going to force my way through this? As a 7, not really wanting to be thorough. We're going to hit this hard, but I'm going to end up being impatient. You see what I'm doing here? The Enneagram gives us a vocabulary to realize that, of course, a conversation about race and identity is going to cut to the jugular. There is already by nature, objectively, the potential for lots of pain and confusion. But then I know that I bring my own issues to this. So what am I trying to say is, in the larger context, feel like I'm just a beginner at these things, and I want to pursue and encourage you to pursue all of these conversations. Yes, free to be angry and scared, to ache for justice, but to also come at it with a kind of otherworldly confidence in the work of the Holy Spirit to lead us and to guide us through this, and also to heal us. With that said, I just don't want the School of Prayer to be a place that alienates people or adds more pain to this conversation. So thank you for hearing me out on that. So please respond to any of that. I'd love to stir up conversation in response to that. See if you have anything to add or to clarify in what I've just shared with you. So now some comments about the School of Contemplative Living. The School of Contemplative Listening. I hope we also have contemplative living. Again, just like the School of Prayer got formed, I don't know what I'm doing. I do and I don't. And it'd be so easy to be so overwhelmed with my lack and to never get anything started. So I have enough faith and confidence to try to stir up a conversation to see who is listening and hearing what's next for you in your journey, and to project a vision of what potentially could happen. So in terms of what I'm cooking up here, for those of you that not met Cammie yet, I cannot wait for you to get to know her. She has always been someone in my journey into spiritual direction whose ideas, thoughts, her heart. I've always wanted to brainstorm and collaborate with her. And I'm so giddy that she has found an eager desire to collaborate with finalizing and putting this together and then co-facilitating it. She is someone who grew up in the Catholic Church, has struggled at times with knowing how to be a part of the Catholic Church, been on a large journey herself, and has come back in the last season of her life to a deep desire to serve the church through spiritual direction. And she has a real pastoral sensibility and a deep wisdom in that. And I don't want to say any more because I want her to be able to do a video like this and to introduce herself to you. And we'll hopefully have that soon. So with that said, the point is I am not so much concerned about all the books we're going to read or all the literature, the technical part of pedagogy, of curriculum development. I can't wait to get to that, and it's going to be great. But what I've been doing mostly right now is putting other contributors into this, because I can't obviously do this all myself. So we do have Jared Ortiz, who is the Catholic scholar at Hope College, one of my dearest friends. Jared did his dissertation on Augustine and has been publishing in the area of deification and developing ecumenical conversations on what is theosis or deification. And so he's going to do some teaching. And then Sharon Garlow Brown is another friend of mine who's done some retreat leading with me. And she's been demure and shy. Doesn't feel like she has quite the credentialing to train spiritual directors. But yet she is, through her books, the Sensible Shoes series, which are so brilliant in being able to reach into the imaginations of people who are just beginning and to call them to the deeper life. I am going to employ Sharon in various conversations on how to translate this contemplative practice into our families and into the local church context. Tom Schwanda was at Kuiper College for many years and spent his last teaching years at Wheaton College and retired from Wheaton just this last spring, and has moved back to Grand Rapids. And he has a background in an explicit evangelical conversation, but he does that through his deep interest in spiritual direction, through the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Vis-a-vis, he's got incredible resources for us in terms of American spirituality, looking at how the contemplative practice is fleshed out through Jonathan Edwards and the Puritans. And that's an area that I'm really weak in. So I think there maybe Chris Hoke is another friend who's not a spiritual director, but he does contemplative work in justice contexts in Washington State. He wrote a book called Wanted. He's collaborated with me on the podcast and is just an awesome friend and learning partner. And there might be one or two more that I'm talking with. The idea is that each of these people will give 1 or 2 days of teaching and instruction with us. But Cammie and I will be then guiding through the larger journey and focusing on practice and what spiritual direction is. So here's the real kicker. Nobody really can be certified to know that I'm going to be an awesome spiritual director. So what we're offering is what we call a certification of completion, which meaning that you've done the required modules to be certified. But as you discern into that, if you're interested in this at all, we have to say that moving into spiritual direction is always a process of discernment. That I'm still in the practice of discerning it as I grow these formation opportunities. So when somebody finishes after a couple years in the School of Contemplative Listening, it's not like we're saying, go start charging people and develop this formal private practice. Someone might finish with 2 years of the School of Contemplative Listening and still not have a clear sense that they're really called to this formal practice. So the gift then, why would I do this otherwise, is that there's all kinds of other arenas where contemplative spirituality and spiritual direction are vital to faith formation, especially in local church contexts. I would say that the invitation and what we're developing is a response to what we could call the apostolic charism, meaning God is calling me to venture forth beyond my insecurities and my weaknesses, to reach out and to gather people and to step out in faith, because the church is lacking in areas of justice and contemplation. So all that we're doing in terms of the podcast, retreat, spiritual direction, school of prayer, school of contemplative listening, I don't know exactly what each person who's involved will be doing. And most likely, most of you will not be engaging in a formal practice of spiritual direction. What I'm hoping is that there will be ripple effects as we do what we can with our rules of life, as we take the next step. And if some of you discern into the School of Contemplative Listening, that will just continue. Discernment will grow discernment, and there will be holy, just, contemplative ripple effects that will reverberate throughout our homes, our churches, our workplaces. There's just a deep lack. I get really earnest. If I'm not careful, that becomes a striving. I believe it's a fire in me. We are missing the piece of contemplative goodness. There's so much panic in our world. There's a lot of reason for the panic. And so we have to look at what is God's justice. How do I join with that? Listening to the conversations of brokenness around us. Not being afraid of these things. Not overreacting, but also not underreacting. And so if you're interested in that further conversation,